not only being a Final Fantasy fan, but a fan of like character action games, I think I might end up really liking it. But especially if the combat's really good, like that will be a nice surprise for me at least. Big sad I'm gonna have to wait like a year and a half to play FF16 on PC. Yeah, although I heard that the way they coded it, it's probably gonna take a while for that PC port to end up being functional. So it's like, well, you know. Maybe it is the kind of deal that it's like that waiting out on it might be a better bet than if they tried to launch them at the same time. Now, part of that is probably due to how the game's coded as well, so that's also to be taken into account. Well, I mean, like, Final Fantasy is such a weird one when people are like, yeah, I'm never going to play another Final Fantasy game again. It's like, why? Because they're all really different. So how do you know? It's almost like if they didn't call them Final Fantasy, that would then you be more willing to give it a shot? Like, I don't know. Like, I mean, Final Fantasy 16, I think, looks really good. It definitely doesn't seem to play like an old school turn-based Final Fantasy game, but they haven't for a while also, so I guess like I think that there's no shortage of turn-based RPGs. Like they are out there. It's not very likely that Final Fantasy is ever going to become one of those again, and I mean I have my own feelings on that, as like I wish that wasn't necessarily the case because I like turn-based combat. But I mean, there's the Trails games, there's Tales. Oh, no, wait, Tales is real time, isn't it? I've never played Tales, but I've played Trails. It's really good turn-based combat. Octopath Traveler is great, and it's Square Enix even. And they easily could have called that Final Fantasy, I think. Like, I think if they called Octopath Traveler Final Fantasy, I don't know, Journey of the Eight, then I have a feeling that no one would have batted an eye. And they would have just changed the name of the spells. Okay, but Final Fantasy is the turn. No, it's not, though. It hasn't been for a long time. Like, the last time that that a Final Fantasy game was turn-based, like pure turn-based, was 10? That was like PlayStation 2 is the last time it was turn-based. You know, it's like, well, I mean, so is it a turn-based franchise anymore? Like it certainly was. I love the old Final Fantasy games. I'm playing Final Fantasy 6 and 4 in my spare time. And 7, actually. I still haven't finished my replay of 7, actually. I should play that again. Or get back to playing that. I almost don't think that saying like, well, I can't play this Final Fantasy because it's real time. I'm like, well, I mean, I don't know. That means you haven't been able to play Final Fantasy for a really long time, I guess. Because even 12 had kind of real-time combat. I mean, like that, but I don't know that I'd agree that like the last time Final Fantasy was good was 10. Like, because 12 is pretty good. Like, 14 is great. It's a different type of game, but it is still like a really great game. And 15, I think, is that's the one that I think is debatably not really an RPG at all. Like, it is kind of just an open world action game. So I think I'd have the most sympathy towards arguments against 15 specifically, but also it's like, well, I mean, they fired that team and it's a new team making 16 and they're the people who made 14, which is good. So I don't know. I just don't think, I don't think that the combat pace is enough to write off an entire series. Now, granted, I've not played Final Fantasy 16. It might be fucking horrible. I'm not trying to defend it because I've not played it, but I don't think that the reason it'll be horrible or not is because it's real time. Like, I think it's a choice they made. I think it'll either work or it won't, and that will largely depend on how good the gameplay ends up being. But ultimately, I think it's like, well, I mean, if it's good, it's good. I'm not gonna say, even if this game's good, I'm gonna say it's bad because it's not what I want from Final Fantasy. You know, like, 'cause Final Fantasy is. It's not really a series with a consistent identity. It has echoes between installments. Like, well, the spells are called the same stuff. There's always similar monsters. Some of the items carry over names, you know? Like, it's things like that, not full-blown, yeah, you need to play Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6 in order to understand 7. It's never really been that kind of series, and I think that they made a choice to have the gameplay start being radically different between installments, and I think that, you can feel about that choice how you feel, but I guess I just don't necessarily think that once that choice is made, that means everything to the right of that choice is absolutely going to be bad. Like, I mean, they could still make good games. They just might be different than what the old Final Fantasy games were. And that's not to say that it's like, well, it's not really what I want from Final Fantasy, so I hate that they call it Final Fantasy. I would just say that it would be better to take an objective. Because, I mean, like, you can make the same argument for Zelda. This is not what a lot of people want from Zelda. And I'm sympathetic to that as well. I'm like, yeah, well, I guess, yeah, if your whole deal is I want a dungeon crawler, I don't want a big open world sandbox game. That's a valid stance, But I would also say that doesn't necessarily make this a bad game just because it's not a good example of Zelda. I mean, but not everyone loves every one of those, Jimmy. There are people that will say that 8 is the worst in the series. I think the vast majority of Final Fantasy fans, including myself, have not played Final Fantasy 1, 2, or 3. I mean, I fiddled around with them, but I've never played them from beginning to end. I just couldn't really get into them. I love 4, though, and I love 6. Those are my 2 favorite ones. If anything, I'd say that, like, 7 is where it kind of started becoming not Final Fantasy anymore, because it became more about the, like, crazy epic cinematics in a lot of ways. And that's sort of where 8 went off the rails as well. At the same time, I like 7. I like 8. And I can never really get into 9, but I've heard a lot of good stuff about 9. I feel like I will get through it someday. I've got to not wander around here. I need to put down the controller. Change like I do, like the junction system or the epic time battle materia system. Well, I mean, no. A change in the way the game is constructed and what you're doing and how people engage with the game at afterwards. Like, Final Fantasy VII was a much more large scale cinematic proposition than any other RPG before it ever. And I think it did a lot to push not even just role-playing game development in some directions that I think may have had some negative effects on the industry, just like an overemphasis on cinematic presentation and less of an emphasis on rich storytelling or gameplay. Now, I think Final Fantasy VII still had quite a good story, but I think that it's telling that a lot of people will think of Final Fantasy VII as the best in the series, when many of those same people just will refuse to play 6. Because I'm like, well, 6 is kind of a better game, though. It's like, I mean, and like you could feel about that how you feel as well, because I mean, there's discussions to be had. But I think that there was a pretty significant change between the 2D Final Fantasy games, even between the NES era and the Super NES era, and the 3D matte painting ones, or what would you call them, diorama style, where it's a pre-rendered background and pixelated characters running around on top of it. Like, there were a lot of people that were like, it's very restrictive because they have to have these very detailed cinematic backgrounds for everything, where you can have much more complex dungeons that are designed better when they're just like, they're pixel art, or I don't know. Like, there's arguments people have against every single time a series will make a big evolution, and I usually think that the best way to approach it is just look at each game individually and decide, okay, do I like this game? But less do I like this game in the context of the different games of the series that came before it, but what is this game? And is it good? And I think that's just kind of the better way to look at it. And I think that you're more than welcome to not play 16. Like, I'm sort of not trying to talk you into it, although I guess it is sort of sounding like that. What I'm more trying to say is I would not be so quick to write off an actual, like, a full-blown franchise of games because they've moved in a direction which is unlike where it began. And I don't think it's the same as Star Wars, because that's purely narrative, And if it's narrative entirely, then that's a different question. Like, I think you're well within your rights to not buy The Last of Us Part 3 because you don't like what they've done to the story. Even if you said, hey, I love the gameplay in Last of Us Part 2, which personally I did not. But if you did, yeah, you could say, I love the gameplay, but I hate the story so much that there's no chance I'm getting the third one. I think that's totally fine. But with Final Fantasy, it's kind of hard to make that assertion because all the stories are totally different. So it's really just the game we're talking about. And if the narratives are different and the game structure is different, the game design is different, even the game genre might be different, is there anything that's really making these things comparable against each other than the title? You know? So it's like, well, like Final Fantasy, that's what I'm saying. I think Final Fantasy is a weird series to do that for, because hell, there's 5 different types of games and 3 or 2 different canons in Final Fantasy VII. Like it's not really a series that is in a box at any point, which is why I think it's sometimes a little bit strange that people get adamant that it be put into a box, because they're like, Final Fantasy is effectively just their brand for being like, hey, this is our big budget RPG we're doing now. Like big budget cinematic game that is JRPG in tone and style, regardless of what we end up doing with the gameplay. And I mean, that I think that you could make arguments against that, sure, but it's like, well, at the same time, it's like, what do you actually hate? Just the fact that they're calling it Final Fantasy? Because, like, I mean, I don't know that I can say firmly what Final Fantasy is, because I mean, if you say that, hey, 10 was the last bad one, I know a lot of people who flat out hate 10. Like, they think 10 is ridiculous. They're just like, Blitzball was the stupidest idea. That's not real Final Fantasy. Like, so that's what I mean. Like, it's why I'm like, well, what is real Final Fantasy? Like, Final Fantasy, it's really just a collection of enemy names and spells, ultimately. To me, when it comes right down to it, that is the core of what Final Fantasy is. Just like the core of what Persona is usually high school protagonists, social links, and a bunch of collections of enemies and spells. That's how Persona and Shin Megami Tensei link. You know, it's common elements, I guess, only. Blitzball was fine to me. The sphere, I mean, well, that's the thing. And people were saying the sphere grid system as well kind of ruined the game. It's like, that's sort of what I mean. Like, I don't know. Like, Final Fantasy is just one of those series that I don't think I'm ever going to be like, well, I'm not going to play it because this isn't what the previous game or games were like. Because it's like, well, I mean, I don't know. Final Fantasy is one of those series where I kind of expect it to radically change. And because there's not much in common between each one, aside from, like, especially now, like, because the gameplay conventions aren't really common. And like, Jimmy, I want to say that, like, I'm not trying to argue you out of your perspective. I'm sorry if I didn't keep I'm not sure if I did, because sometimes people tell me that I sound like I'm giving people shit when I'm really just kind of explaining my perspective. I don't think you're wrong. I disagree with the reasoning. And I think it's okay for us to disagree on each other's reasoning, because I'm 100% certain you will disagree with me on reasons I have for doing tons of stuff. What I gather is that you see a major difference between all games, and I see the major split taking place kind of leading up to the time where Square Enix Mooters started taking place. I mean, yeah, no, and they definitely did change they changed their goals as far as what they wanted to make, and I think that where I would make the argument is that the pieces were being put in place for the merger with Enix and then integration of IDOS and pursuit of the Western market, an increased emphasis on more cinematic games. I think you can make the argument that started happening when Final Fantasy VII was released, because Final Fantasy VII was the one that told them, oh shit, if we make them really pretty and look like movies, white people buy them. Like Americans, just regular ass Americans. People at the other side of the world who only buy Madden were buying Final Fantasy VII. And that was a pretty big deal. And I think it probably put the The pieces on the chessboard in moving towards getting towards full-blown cinematic action games for Final Fantasy. Because Final Fantasy became their cash cow. Because of the choices that were made in its presentation. So I do see those things as being connected. Even though those games played a lot more like Final Fantasy 4, 5, and 6, I don't think you can make the argument that they were similar games as far as the experience of playing them. Like they're really, really a different thing. And I think you can make the argument that it's probably more different like once you go real time, but I'd say that 10 removing active time battle was probably the first time since 4 that they just, because active time battle in 5 and was it in 6? I feel like it is it not? I don't know. I've been playing 6 and 7 at the same time and it's messing me up. It's also been about a month and a half since I've touched 6. Understand why people despise 15. Story of the game is split over multiple pieces of media. Yeah, and that's another major problem with it. I'd say even more so than Kingsglaive, the Brotherhood anime. It's Brotherhood? Is it Final Fantasy 15 Brotherhood? The anime that's on YouTube, it's free. But if you watch those 4 anime give you a really good idea of why the friends are important to each other, or why all of them are important to Noctis and why Noctis is important to them. So and Kingsglaive's a lot of fun. The story is mid. It's an action scene. It's a long action scene where fucking Jesse from Breaking Bad has to help Lady Lunafreya get out of the city as it's collapsing. But it does also give you the premise for what happens between chapter 2 and 3 of 15, which is glossed over with a couple clips from the movie. And you don't understand how the entire kingdom falls, but that thing is in the movie, so that was a weird choice. The main thing is that most of these games are lacking compelling protagonists. Cloud and Squall are amazing characters. I mean, I think, a lot of people like Cloud. A lot of people don't like Squall, though, because they get mixed up with how he's related to Laguna. And I mean, a lot of people hate 8, man. I'm telling you. I like 8. I will defend it. And X-Ray Girl likes it a lot, too. But it is the kind of thing that 8 is often looked at as the absolute worst one in the series by a lot of people. And I don't really agree, but I guess it's like, well, I mean, you can think that though, because there's no reason why if you love Final Fantasy 1 through 7, you will like 8 at all, because to me, they're all different. They're all totally different stories with different systems, kind of different lore, and they have connecting threads. One of those connecting threads is there anyone I can talk to here? What do I actually have to do here? I'm not going down the well. Oh, wait, hold on. There is someone I can talk to. Sweet. Yeah, they have connecting threads, but mostly, to me, they're entire different properties. So I'm like... And, I mean, I think I would agree that 8 would probably be the easiest one to adapt, because to me, when everyone was raving about Harry Potter, I was just like, oh, so it's a magic school. It's like Final Fantasy 8. Like, I mean, what's the big deal? So that came out years ago. And you were like, no, it's Harry Potter. It's great. It's a school where they learn to be wizards. I was like, yeah, fucking, like, I learned Firaga in high school. So what's the difference? I don't see how this J.K. Rowling person has written something so much better than Final Fantasy VIII, when to me it was the same, or the same concept. And I personally liked the draw system and the junction system. I thought it was an interesting way to use spells that felt really different from 7 and 6, which are the 2 I had played prior. And it was, I don't know, pretty good. Like, I have no real problem with 8, man. I think it's good stuff. I don't think it'll ever get the Final Fantasy VII Remake treatment. Making a video about how the Mandalorian retcons the Old Republic. Oh, that's rewritten it 3 times. I'm going to rewrite it the 4th. But yeah, okay, so then everyone's subbed to Jimmy Cobb. Jimmy had a respectful conversation with me about Final Fantasy, on which we disagreed but I think I think we presented each other's perspectives, and I think it was a good talk. I like talking about Final Fantasy. I like Final Fantasy.